Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals. So welcome to the Safer Chemicals Podcast. Today, Tim and Maria join us in the studio. Tim is the chair of our Committee for Risk Assessment, and Maria chairs the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee. So glad you could both make it. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for having me.
For our listeners, the two committees prepare scientific opinions that are then used by the European Commission and EU member states when deciding how chemical risks need to be controlled. The committees are made up of scientists from EU member states and have observers from EU organizations that represent many different sectors and interests. So let's start with the Risk Assessment Committee. Now, Tim, you are fresh out of the June meeting, although looking at the agenda, fresh might not be the right word after days of what must have been pretty intense discussions on some big topics. I hope you still have some energy left for our talk.
No problem.
Let's get right to it then. So the committee adopted two interesting opinions on harmonized classification and labeling. Now, for our listeners, harmonized classification and labeling is when chemicals are given a consistent and mandatory hazard classification and labeling requirement in the EU. So this is particularly important for chemicals that can harm us or the environment. But yeah, back to glyphosate. So as many of you probably know, it's a common herbicide used in agriculture and horticulture to combat weeds. You might even find it in some of your gardening products that you have under your sink. The second is silver, and in this case it is used as an antimicrobial in biocidal products like disinfectants and preservatives. We'll also be talking about restricting the use of lead in ammunition for hunting, outdoor sports shooting, and in fishing later in the episode. But let's go ahead with glyphosate. So it's had a lot of public attention recently. It's been approved for use in plant protection products in the EU until the 15th of December this year. There's also an application from industry to renew the approval, which 4 EU countries have assessed. Now, I understand that ECHA and the European Food Safety Authority, so EFSA, are sharing the workload in evaluating the member states' assessment. Tim, could you first explain the role of ECHA and the Risk Assessment Committee in this approval process?
I'll try and do it as simply as possible. When a pesticide comes up for renewal, it goes through the EFSA process for risk assessment. And as part of that process, ECHA relooks at the classification and labeling to provide an opinion which can be fitted into EFSA's work. So the two work together. We only look at the hazards of glyphosate as an active substance. We don't look at the risks. That's EFSA's task, and they have to look at the risks of the use of glyphosate in formulated pesticidal products. So the two roles are quite distinct. They're complementary.
All right. And what does the committee's opinion kind of focus on exactly?
Well, our focus is on the intrinsic properties of the active substance glyphosate. So we would look at everything from the physical hazards like explosivity, if there's any suggestion of that. We would also look at acute toxicity. We would also look at the aquatic environment. And then, of course, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and toxicity to reproduction are the big three. But there's other things like skin sensitization, respiratory sensitization. They all have to be looked at and examined in the review for the renewal.
Right. Okay. So quite a wide range of classifications that you look at, focusing on the most harmful ones.
It's about 15 or more hazard classes, in fact.
Right. Okay. Well, let's then move on to the opinion itself. So what did the committee conclude on the hazards of glyphosate?
Well, the committee concluded basically no change to the whole classification. So there are two acute classifications, one acute classification, and then there's an aquatic classification for chronic aquatic toxicity. But those are the only classifications across the board. So our opinion, the conclusion is the same as previously in 2017. I have to say, though, that this is not just a rubber stamping exercise. We've done this before, so we just conclude the same again. You have a different dossier submitter this time. The last time the dossier was submitted by Germany, and we evaluated that dossier. This time, 5 years later, it's a new dossier submitted by Sweden, France, the Netherlands, and Hungary. And they have done it from the ground up. This is not just a copy-paste exercise. And our evaluation has taken that new dossier thoroughly and gone through it piece by piece. So this is a re-evaluation, but it's a fresh evaluation from first principles.
Right. Okay. So there's a lot of new scientific evidence that I guess you've looked at as part of the review. What kind of data was looked at?
We were presented with three main sources of evidence. The first one, these are the guideline studies. By guideline, I mean studies carried out to an international standard and usually under good laboratory practice or GLP. And these are the studies carried out by the applicants, and they're the mandatory part of a pesticide dossier. They have to be there. The second main area of evidence we looked at is the epidemiology studies. And these are studies which look at potential effects of glyphosate in humans specifically. And the third source then is the large amount of papers in the scientific literature, particularly those that have been published since RAC's previous opinion in 2017. And bearing in mind the literature search for that would have been about a year older. So these are the three main sources that we looked at. And for the first type, the guideline studies, particularly carcinogenicity, we evaluated in detail the tumor types in the 7 rat studies and the 5 mice studies. And these studies were all regarded as valid. In doing so, we looked at the strength of the statistical evidence, but we also looked at the biological relevance of the findings in those studies to come to a conclusion. With the second source of information, the epidemiology studies, we particularly looked at the latest findings from the ongoing cohort study. That's called the Agricultural Health Study. It's being carried out in the United States, and it's produced about 17 years of data so far. But we also looked at the available case control studies, reviews, reanalyses, and meta-analyses. The case control studies are usually more difficult to interpret. And with the Agricultural Health Study, it's not showing a risk at present for cancer from glyphosate. RAC agreed, therefore, on balance, that the findings in the many rat and mice animal studies, as well as the epidemiology and relevant studies from the literature, didn't provide sufficient evidence for classification for carcinogenicity.
Of course, it's natural that a lot of these studies are done by industry because they have to do that to comply with different pieces of regulation. So it makes sense that there's a lot of it out there from industry. What about then studies that are maybe not from industry that show different results or different outcomes?
It depends on how relevant they are to the classification of the product. I mean, if they're studies which are basically about the risks, then they're more relevant to the EFSA process and not to the ECHA process. So that's quite clear. And sometimes they're a bit borderline, they could have a bearing on both. So they have to be selected very carefully as to which process part of the process they're relevant for.
Okay, I mean, mentioning one by name, so the WHO's International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, famously concluded in 2015, and I quote here, that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic to humans. Can you explain a little bit why they came to such a different outcome?
I mean, they're an international agency working under the UN system, and they have a very high reputation in cancer research, very well known worldwide. I think the answer is quite simple. It's just that the methodology that IARC uses and that we use in classification and labeling is different. And IARC uses, as far as I'm aware, only studies which are in the public domain, so proprietary studies would not be considered as far as I understand it, whereas the database we look at is considerably larger and contains all of those industry studies which 5 years ago would have been probably confidential, but I don't think they're confidential any longer. So it's just the difference in the databases and the different way of selecting which studies are reviewed.
So if you were to say it as concretely as possible then, if I ask you, is glyphosate carcinogenic or not, what would you say?
Well, under the criteria of classification and labeling, which are very clear and concise, glyphosate is not carcinogenic. In European terms, we do not consider it as a carcinogen.
Well, what about the next steps then? What's happening?
We've agreed our opinion and adopted it. We clearly have some cleaning up to do to make sure it's in good shape before publication. Normally, we would publish our opinions within 10 to 12 weeks of the meeting. I wouldn't like to be tied down to exactly 10 or 12 weeks with this one, but we will get it out as quickly as possible. It will be sent to the Commission and to EFSA and published on our website. So then everybody will have, let's say, the full transcript of our deliberations on all the hazard classes of glyphosate to consider.
So still a way to go before this one reaches the finish line.
Indeed, yes, indeed.
All right, let's then move on to silver. So can you walk us through the opinion? I understood it's been a long time coming on this one.
We've had it through 5 working group and 5 plenary meetings, so we're heading to a year and a half at this stage. Silver is a very big dossier. It's a precious metal. It's used in jewelry, so it's very familiar to everybody, but it has a huge biocidal use in all sorts of products as an antibacterial. I mean, it's used in ceramics, it's used in clothing, it's used in all sorts of places. So because of that, it becomes rather complicated to assess it because it comes in different forms. It's a metal, so it's there as an elemental metal, as an ingot, if you like, in pure form. And by the way, jewelry is never in pure form; it's always an alloy. We're trying to assess the pure metal, and it begins to get interesting and complex because most of the animal studies which are in the dossier have been done on soluble silver salts. So things like silver acetate, for example, silver nitrate. And those, of course, are soluble compounds. They're readily available to be absorbed in the body. We've also got a lot of data on nanoforms of silver, which is in itself an area of assessment. A lot of studies on nano, clearly a lot of interest in laboratories assessing nano silver. But we're asked to assess either powdered or massive forms of silver. So this is the metal itself. So then the question arises as to how we use the data from nano, which is extensive, how we use the data from the soluble silver salts, which is even more extensive, for classifying the metal, which is very difficult to test and has hardly been tested in metallic form. So we have to develop a sort of concept of reading across the data we do have to the data we don't have. And that's why it gets so complicated. And we have to go through that 3-phase assessment for every single one of the hazard classes, from physical properties all the way up to the CMR properties. So that's why it just took a long time. Each of the CMR, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and toxicity to reproduction hazard classes, is the size of a normal CLH dossier. Okay. So you can imagine the effort that goes into this.
Why is it then that there's not so much data available? Why do you have to do the read across?
Well, the metallic form is just very hard to test. That's the problem. And we're looking at nanoforms from 1 nanometer up to 100 nanometers, and then into micron forms above 100 nanometers, into the micron range, and then about 1 millimeter you get to massive, I think they call it. Right. So I mean, one millimeter, sand grain sized particles of silver, you can't really test them in any sensible way. Okay. The powders, there's a gradient there of what can be done, but there's just very little data on powdered forms of silver.
So what's the opinion then? What's
well, the CMR hazard classes, it's no classification for carcinogenicity and mutagenicity, and reproduction we had more doubts about, we had more concerns. We gave it Repro 2 for fertility, so this is based on animal studies. Mm-hmm. We had concerns about fertility, and we had concerns that what we were seeing in the nano grades would run over into the micron grades as they get a bit bigger. Mm-hmm. At least the evidence we had on availability was suggesting that there wasn't too much difference between the lower micron grades of powder and the nano grades for which we had data. So I think that's the best description I can give of it. Okay. So Repro 2 is the main classification proposed, and that's for fertility.
And so just to be clear, you mentioned this already, so your jewelry is safe, but you did say that there's a wide use of silver. So, if I have silver in my sports clothing, some nano form of silver, do I have to worry? These kinds of questions might come up from this.
We're assessing the intrinsic properties of the silver metal so that the Biocidal Products Committee at a later date can look at the risks of silver, and that's where the clothing and all the rest of it comes into it. So at the moment, that process also has a long way to go.
Time to get rid of all my jewelry and my sports clothing.
I think you'll be fine with your jewelry.
All right, well, that covers the two harmonized classification and labeling proposals, unless you want to add something on those?
No, I think that's as much as I wanted to say. I think this is complicated enough as it is without adding more to it.
All right, good. Let's then move on to another topic that is also very much debated, and this is the restriction on the use of lead in ammunition, specifically for hunting, outdoor sports shooting, and in fishing. Now here, the Risk Assessment Committee adopted its opinion, while the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee agreed on its draft opinion. Before we get to you, Maria, let's continue with Tim on the adopted opinion. Can you tell us what was concluded?
Well, we concluded that there is a risk to address in all three areas of hunting, outdoor shooting, and fishing from the use of lead. And that risk is at a European-wide level and needs to be addressed. Simple as that.
Okay, can you tell us a bit more about the concerns? So what's the issue?
Well, I mean, lead is a toxic substance. It's toxic to reproduction. Normally, toxic to reproduction is considered as a threshold effect, but lead has a neurotoxic effect, and children are particularly susceptible. So it's usually considered to be non-threshold. And in the European Union, our procedure for dealing with non-threshold substances like that of this level of concern is to minimize their exposure. And minimizing the exposure really means that there have to be concrete risk management measures in place no matter what the use is. And as you can imagine, with outdoor shooting, it is not possible to apply risk management measures when lead is being shot into the open environment. On shooting ranges, that's a little bit different because it is possible to apply risk management measures. So there's a set of risk management measures attached to a derogation. With fishing, it's, I think in the risks in a sense are similar to shooting in that lead sinkers and small lead split shot on fishing lines readily gets into the open environment. We know it's eaten by wading birds and other birds, kept in their crop as a sort of a meal to grind their food with, and slowly poisons them. And I think one of the biggest concerns, clearly human health is a concern in this, but concern for wildlife is one of the big drivers of this restriction as well. And that's that we think that up to 1 million birds a year die of lead poisoning in the European Union. This was also the basis of the restriction on shooting in wetlands, which was adopted by went to a decision by the Commission not so long ago. So this is also part of the reason for wanting to restrict the use of lead for in fishing and in outdoor shooting as well. It's a wide distributive use. Right. That's what it comes down to.
What about then in terms of the reductions that could result from this restriction? What are we talking about in terms of numbers of lead emissions into the environment, for example?
Hard to tell. I mean, there is already a large stock of lead in the environment, which is not going to go away. I think the purpose of this restriction is to, as quickly as possible, not put any more into the environment. Maybe Maria can address the issues of the tonnage and the reduction in tonnage that's expected, but it's substantial amounts of lead that go into the environment every year.
We'll get to that with Maria then in a minute. What did the committee, in addition to all this, consider when making its opinion? So what kind of studies did you look at?
We looked very much at, well, there's a consultation ahead of, there's actually a call for evidence while ECHA is devising the restriction proposal. This came from ECHA, it didn't come from a member state. So there's a call for evidence at that point, and a huge amount of information comes in. Then there's a consultation ahead of or during opinion development in both RAC and SAIC. And a lot more information comes in that consultation. So basically that all has to be collated, assessed, replied to, and the valuable bits then go into the opinion for consideration. And part of the consultation did cause a redrafting of part of the dossier submitter's proposal in relation to the risk management measures at shooting grounds, which I mentioned. Right. So it did have the consultation did have an impact on the development of the opinions.
All right. Now, what about, there was this one study that was done by the European Food Safety Authority, particularly on the consumption of game meat and its impact on human health. Yeah. Was that something that was considered, and how?
It was indeed. I mean, it's at the heart of the assessment of risks to families of shooters or families of people who hunt game and who might be using that meat for food on a regular basis. That data was provided by EFSA, so we had full access to it from the very beginning and discussed it at quite some length. Some of the contributions through other stakeholders, particularly the NGOs, came up with new assessments of that type of information as well. So we looked at that and took that into account as well. The data is quite variable, but that's what you would expect. It's if it's a market survey, it's sort of picking products off shelves and having them analyzed without necessarily knowing what the conditions of shooting were. So there is some uncertainties in it, but we felt that it was quite compelling information, to be honest. Right. There's another aspect I'd like to mention, and it's one where we consider that there is a risk to human health, but we couldn't really assess it in any quantitative way. And that's to do mainly with fishing and partly some forms of hunting, but I think mainly fishing. And that's where individuals or a shop owner, let's say, would on an ad hoc basis cast their own fishing weights. So putting a pot on a stove, right, melting scrap lead, and then pouring it into molds.
With proper risk management measures in place?
With probably no risk management measures in place. Right. At least that's the concern. Mm-hmm. This happening on a consumer basis is rather worrying. We didn't really get sufficient information to be able to evaluate it properly, but it remains there as a concern in the backs of our minds as something that might need addressing in the future. Right,
so in doing that, they would be exposed to kind of lead fumes, dust, again, particularly of concern for any children in a family that would be doing that. And do you have some kind of feeling of how common this might be?
That's the problem, we don't.
None at all?
No, we identified it as a risk, but we really had great difficulty in assessing the context.
Right.
So we think it happens, mainly because there's a wide range of products for casting lead on the market, simple as that.
Okay. Anyway, as you mentioned, the main driver for this proposal is the impact on the environment, the birds dying, and also endangered species, and the kind of the amount of lead that gets put into the environment because of its use. So the human health side is important, but not the main driver in this case.
It's clearly in there as a central concern, but this the dossier submitter examined a whole range of different environmental compartments, a whole range of different types of potential exposures to surface water, to groundwater, to a whole range of situations. And on a qualitative basis, we graded those potential risks across a whole range of categories. So it's really a very broad look at the use of lead in hunting, shooting, and fishing, and every type of impact or every type of risk that you might encounter from it.
We're then going to move on to you, Maria, and talk more about the socio-economic aspects of the same restriction. So here the committee agreed on its draft opinion on the same restriction proposal as the RAC just did for the final opinion. So what were the highlights of the SAC assessment?
Well, basically, we support the proposed restriction, and we consider that it is appropriate to address the risks that Tim has told you all about, and to ensure a level of protection that is consistent both for people and for the environment in the EU. And I note that that includes that we think that it is proportionate as well. So that's kind of the main conclusion. There were a few areas where there were some modifications that were proposed based on the assessment. So the way it works is that ECA prepared a proposal. We look at it, we analyze it, and there were some areas where the committee thought that things should be a little bit different. So I'll highlight a couple of them.
Yep.
First change that I would like to highlight is that we thought that the transition period that was suggested for using lead gunshot in hunting, which was 5 years in the original proposal, we think that that's not necessary. We think that a shorter one could actually work. So basically the idea is that in the proposal, it was thought that there was limited capacities to produce steel gunshots, so that more time would be needed. However, when the committee analyzed the evidence, it found that there wasn't really well substantiated that issue. We think that about 18 months could be sufficient. So it's an initial proposal. It's not completely certain that 18 months should be the actual final one, but the question is asked then for the consultation on the SEAC opinion to provide information and support conclusion on what SEAC is actually going to recommend on this one.
Right, okay. Coming from 5 years to 18 months sounds like a big reduction there. So I guess there will be some interest in the consultation also. I guess the biggest impact here is for hunters, obviously. So they will need to make a change faster.
Yeah, the producers of the alternatives, we think that they can make it in that time. So basically the original concern was whether they would be able to have alternatives ready in time. However, we think that alternatives are available in most sizes and gauges. And actually as well, hunting considerably contributes to the benefits of the proposal. So it's important to give only as much as is needed and no more than that. So that's the initial proposal. Let's see how the industry reacts and what evidence they present about it.
Right, okay. One thing I want to touch upon here is the price. So you mentioned steel. Of course, there's other alternatives there. But for a hunter, for example, making the transition from lead shot to steel shot, is there a big difference in price?
We think that at the moment, the prices are comparable. Of course, it's not just the cost of the actual material, it's the cost of, in some cases, adapting guns or buying new guns. Some of the old ones would need to be adapted. But in general, we've looked at all the potential impacts, and we've looked at something that we call affordability. So what the cost would be per hunter. And we find that that is something that is quite affordable if you look at it from that point of view. So in terms of the increasing cost, that is not something that we think is very significant per hunter.
Right. And of course, there is the idea of supply and demand. So once the demand goes up for one of these alternatives, the prices, one would assume, would also drop.
Yes, that is something that could very possibly happen. But of course, as well, the other thing that we need to think about is that prices of metals do change over time. So it's a little bit difficult to say that because they are comparable today, it would be the same tomorrow. But
right.
All these things have been considered.
Okay, so for sports shooting, there was also a derogation, right?
Yeah, we actually have two different kinds of derogations that we're talking about here. So when we're talking about what the proposal calls projectile other than gunshots, so we're talking bullets mostly, then there is a derogation. They're proposed that is conditional on having appropriate risk management measures there, and there's a description of what those may be. However, for lead gunshot, it's a little bit different. So here we have got what we called an optional derogation for the decision makers. So the proposal is actually a ban. However, if the decision makers think that they would like to allow this to continue to be used, then we propose certain conditions that would have to be met in the shooting ranges in order to allow the use of lead gunshots. Right. So it's a little bit different. It's not actually supported by the dossier submitted. This is not what they would prefer, but they understand that the decision makers may want to bring something like this.
Okay, so it's good to have that option there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And SEAC has assessed this as well. We are not saying whether we prefer one or the other. We're just simply assessing the potential impacts of having this in place. And one proposal that SEAC has made is that if it was to be brought in, this derogation, we think that the shot sizes that could be allowed should be limited to a more narrow range than in the original proposal. So basically the ones that are actually used in sports shooting. We know that in hunting some slightly larger ones are used. So we think that we should have it more limited so that it's a little bit easier to enforce as well. So we're talking about between 1.9 and 2.6 millimeters.
Right. Okay. So just for my own understanding, the idea here is that by reducing the size, you reduce the amount of lead that could potentially leak.
No, it's not so much that. It's more that for hunting, there's also larger sizes that are used. But for sports shooting, the sizes used are a little bit more narrow. So we don't see the point in allowing sizes that are not used. And it makes up, actually, if someone has the larger sizes, it's known that they shouldn't be using it for uses that are allowed.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's clear. Thank you, for me at least, to understand. All right. What about the impact of this restriction on military use of lead ammunition? I know that's something that's also been talked about. So was it so that military use is completely excluded from the proposal?
Yes, basically there are some uses and applications that are simply not associated with the identified risks, so they are kept outside of the scope of the proposal. Here we're talking about police, law enforcement and military applications, so that is there. However, there have been some issues raised throughout the assessment about whether the proposal in non-military uses could have some effects that would have an impact on military uses. One of them is the security of the supply of ammunition, whether the ban would then mean that there's not enough ammunition that will be available for military use, even if it's allowed.
Right, because people will be moving towards other types of...
Yes, exactly. So would there be enough supply? Would there be enough production for them to be able to have what they need for military use? So that was something that has been considered by the committee. It was assessed. And basic conclusion was that as SEAC doesn't consider that this would be an issue. We think that because the ammunition would still be allowed in sports shooting, then we think that there will be enough production to allow for some security in the supply. So we don't think that this is a major issue at all, actually pretty minor, and we think this should be safe. But it's good that we have looked at this, I think. The other issue is that has been raised by quite a few people is whether the implementation of the restriction would lead to having fewer shooting ranges available for, particularly for reservists to train in. Quite often they're using non-military ranges to train, and if there's fewer nearby, then that may affect the training. And that is an issue that has been raised as a possibility and an uncertainty by SEAC. We don't have a very good idea of what the number of shooting ranges in the end would be.
And this is, I guess, something that you were looking for feedback in the consultation as well.
Absolutely. If someone has got that information, however, it's a little bit uncertain exactly what would actually happen. It's thinking into the future, and there's been a lot of information provided already. It's just not very clear exactly what the reality would be.
Let's then move on to the maybe less talked about, but also a part of this restriction. So the fishing, there as well, there was a derogation, correct?
Well, there are a couple of derogations where SEAC, well, in general, we've concluded that it would be proportionate to have the restriction as proposed. But there are a couple of potential derogations where they haven't been supported in the initial proposal, but SEAC considers that they could be justified on socio-economic grounds. And these are for lead sinkers and lures that are over 50 grams, and also something called lead split shots. So the idea there is that we don't really have the information to be able to conclude. For now, we're not supporting a derogation, but we're inviting people to provide information on the potential socioeconomic impacts of that, particularly the availability of alternatives. That we're asking to be provided during the consultation, and if there is enough evidence to support a derogation there, we may well do so.
Okay, good. Maybe then moving to the actual impacts of the restrictions. So what kind of benefits are you expecting from this?
Well, we're talking about a reduction of 633,000 tons of lead over 20 years. So we have looked at the proposal over 20 years, and we are comparing the situation with a restriction in place against the situation that would be if we did not have the restriction. And that's the difference. It's preventing the emission into the environment of that huge quantity of lead. There are also other kinds of benefits around impact on birds, around impact on humans from consuming the game meat, and that ranges from chronic kidney disease to IQ loss. So, quite a wide ranging of things. Some of these have been quantified and are included in the proposal. Some have been described only qualitatively, but it's really important that we don't lose track of those things that have only been described qualitatively. They can be just as important as the ones we are able to put numbers on.
Going then on to the consultation on the opinion. So that will soon start, and you covered a little bit about this already, but what kind of information in a nutshell then is the committee looking for?
Yeah, the consultation starts on the 29th of June, so the opinion will be published then, and the final version of the proposal will be there alongside it for people to look at. So there will be some specific questions that will be asked, and one of them I've mentioned, for instance, already, this issue of the different types of fishing-related lures and split shots. So if there's information there, we would like to receive it. And then, of course, I mentioned that we had proposed a shorter transition period for lead gunshot. I said we've got a starting proposal of 18 months, but we would like to have some information to come to our final proposal, and that's something we would really appreciate information on. There is also a request for information on some antique weapons and muzzle loaders that are used in different types of activities. So there it's difficult to come to a conclusion, so we've asked for more information there. And yeah, there will be a few other questions on areas where they are a little bit more uncertain. So we will have that published alongside the consultation. But it's important to emphasize as well that we are looking for those things specifically, but any kind of information can be submitted that is relevant to the socio-economic assessment. Of course, we cannot really assess stuff that's more in the remit of our sister committee, the Risk Assessment Committee. But if there is something in the opinion where people think that they have more information or information that contradicts our assessment, we would be particularly interested in hearing it.
Okay, good. That's clear. So it starts on the 29th of June and it runs for
60 days. So until the end of August, I think that would be.
Right. And then what happens after the consultation?
Well, then we look at all the different comments and analyze them. And that will take a while. We had over 300 comments in the initial consultation, so we expect that we will have quite a lot now. Right. Normally, the legislation expects that we would basically then consider them very quickly and adopt the opinion in the next plenary. With this kind of proposal, it's just not doable. Right. So we will be looking at adopting the final opinion amended to reflect any new information provided in the consultation in December, in our plenary in December.
Then thank you both for taking the time to join us and for the deeper look into the work of the committees. A lot of interesting topics and a lot more coming up in the future meetings. So I look forward to having you back with us after the next meetings, hopefully in September, where we expect to hear about the restriction of PAHs in clay targets from both of the committees in this case. If you want to know more about the committees or the topics discussed in this episode, visit eco.europa.eu. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, also eco.europa.eu/podcasts, and remember to give us feedback through our short questionnaire. There's a link to that in the episode description. Thank you and goodbye. Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.